Hello, this is the Saturday Grab Bag, and I'm going to start that with J.D. Vance's speech in Munich. Munich. Ironic, really, isn't it, for anyone who knows any history of the 20th century? Anyway, J.D. Vance made a speech about freedom of speech at a conference in Munich. And it turns out that one of the things that he made much of was the fact that he couldn't meet the AfD leader at that conference because the AfD leader was being kept out of it. At a Munich conference where the Vice President of the USA had to talk about freedom of speech. You couldn't make it up. I'm Granniopteryx. I'm on YouTube, Rumble, BitChute and Minds. And here we go. Take it away, JD.
We gather at this conference, of course, to discuss security. And normally we mean threats to our we gather at this conference, of course, to discuss security. And normally we mean threats to our external security. I see many great military leaders gathered here today. But while the Trump administration is very concerned with European security and believes that we can come to a reasonable settlement between Russia and Ukraine, and we also believe that it's important in the coming years for Europe to step up in a big way to provide for its own defense, the threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values shared with the United States of America. And perhaps most concerningly, I look to our very dear friends, the United Kingdom, where the backslide away from conscience rights has placed the basic liberties of religious Britons in particular in the crosshairs.
I have to point something out. He's talking to a lot of Europeans. Free speech has never been a feature of European civilization. In Germany, in France, they've never had free speech. They've always had authoritarian governance of various sorts. It's waxed and waned somewhat, but it has always been there. That's because European law, which depends largely on Napoleonic war, is a system whereby you can do it if the law says you can do it. Britain has always been different. In British law, you can do anything, provided the law hasn't actually forbidden it. In European law, the Napoleonic Code, you can only do it if there's somewhere in a book that says you can. This is a completely different attitude to freedom of speech, freedom of action, general freedom. And when Vance is talking about Britain, he is talking about a completely different setup from anything that exists in Europe. And any criticism he's giving of Europe is doubly embarrassing for any British person listening to this, because we are heading away from freedom of speech faster than those guys in France, and that's saying something. All right, let's carry on.
A little over 2 years ago, the British government charged Adam Smith Connor, a 51-year-old physiotherapist and an Army veteran, with the heinous crime of standing 50 meters from an abortion clinic and silently praying for 3 minutes. Not obstructing anyone, not interacting with anyone, just silently praying on his own. And after British law enforcement spotted him and demanded to know what he was praying for, Adam replied simply, it was on behalf of the unborn son he and his former girlfriend had aborted years before. Now, the officers were not moved. Adam was found guilty of breaking the government's new buffer zones law, which criminalizes silent prayer and other actions that could influence a person's decision within 200 meters of an abortion facility. He was sentenced to pay thousands of pounds in legal costs to the prosecution. Now, I wish I could say that this was a fluke, a one-off crazy example of a badly written law being enacted against a single person. But no, this last October, just a few months ago, the Scottish government began distributing letters to citizens whose houses lay within so-called safe access zones, warning them that even private prayer within their own homes may amount to breaking the law. Naturally, the government urged readers to report any fellow citizens suspected guilty of thought crime. In Britain and across Europe, free speech, I fear, is in retreat. And in the interest of comedy, my friends, but also in the interest of truth, I will admit that sometimes the loudest voices for censorship have come not from within Europe, but from within my own country, where the prior administration threatened and bullied social media companies to censor so-called misinformation. Misinformation like, for example, the idea that coronavirus had likely leaked from a laboratory in China. Our own government encouraged private companies to silence people who dared to utter what turned out to be an obvious truth. In Washington, there is a new sheriff in town, and under Donald Trump's leadership, we may disagree with your views, but we will fight to defend your right to offer it in the public square, agree or disagree. In England, they voted for Brexit, and agree or disagree, they voted for it. And more all over Europe, they're voting for political leaders who promise to put an end to out-of-control migration.
After that, he spoke to the AfD leader, which was a very sensible thing to do. It means that when the AfD do take over Germany, they will be able to speak to the American government and the American government to them without any embarrassment or awkwardness. And they will take over, and they'll take over because of this. So an asylum seeker, this fellow here, who had a life good enough to enable him to buy a nice looking car, and Mini Coopers are not cheap. I don't know whether he got that second hand, but even second hand they're not cheap. He decided to drive into a crowd of people. Now, the particularly interesting thing about this is that the crowd were actually unionists protesting something to do with union matters. I don't know what it was, wages or work hours or something. The union was called Verdi, and they had nothing to do with Palestine, anti-pro, anything like that. They were talking about a purely internal German matter. What this man did was drive into them, not because he disagreed with their particular politics, but because it was a crowd, and he knew he had the best chance of killing the most people. That was why he did it. And there was a particularly poignant and, well, I hate to say this, but karmic statement made by one of the union organisers. Claudia Weber of the Verdi Union described the scene as incomprehensible. So, all right, let's start with this. She couldn't understand what was going on. I mean, she didn't say it was dreadful, which it was. She didn't say it was murderous, it was horrible. She said it was incomprehensible. And she said that because she couldn't understand why this guy had driven into a union gathering. She described it as incomprehensible because she didn't think it would happen to her, and she was having trouble coming to terms with it. We are completely shocked, she says, and are afraid for our colleagues who were at the march. we heard that the car intentionally crashed into the demonstration. She's still having trouble coming to terms with that. And I have a question for the Verdi Union. Last year, there was a group of people from the Citizens Movement Pax Europa, BPE, in the market square at Mannheim in Baden-Württemberg in Germany. This man went crazy with a knife. He stabbed several people. He stabbed... There was a policeman who saw one victim of the stabbing, thought he was the perpetrator, grabbed the victim, and then the perpetrator stabbed him, which... sorry, there are just no words to describe the bleakness of that comedy. And did the Verdi Union at the time ever speak out against the fact that a legally entitled political group of whatever political persuasion was having a gathering in a town square, and some Islamist nutcase, a nutcase is not the right word, fanatic, took a knife to them? Did anyone in the Verdi Union say that that wasn't right? Did anyone say, I disagree with these people profoundly? I love Muslims. They hate Muslims. They're wrong. Muslims are nice people. But we stand for their right to say what they're saying because we live in a democratic society. Did they say anything like that? No, they didn't. And now they find what happened incomprehensible. And they did that because they didn't think this would happen to them. Right, now, while we're on the subject of Islam, let's talk about this. There's a GB News programme and Lee Anderson was on there ripping into Labour, it says, as it says here that 2 million Gazans have been given the right to flood into Britain. That's not exactly right, really. Oh, just a minute. I'll find a headline. Hang on a minute. Yeah, all right. So, Palestinian success after applying through scheme meant for Ukrainians could open floodgates, Home Office warned. What happened was that a Gazan family who already had a relative here used the law that had to do with giving Ukrainians sanctuary as a means of getting sanctuary in Britain. And the law had actually run out. So technically, there shouldn't have been a question about this. But somehow a judge managed to probably use it as a precedent of some sort. And he gave a family of 6 permission to join their brother in Britain. This is an immigration judge. After the Home Office had already rejected their application. The family had made their application through the Ukraine Family Scheme, which, as I said, was a temporary piece of legislation that was set in place to allow Ukrainians to come in. And the decision to accept their case came despite warnings by lawyers for the Home Office that it could open the floodgates to the admission of all those in conflict zones with family in the UK. So it gave the British government enough of a shock that actually Keir Starmer said that it was wrong and he was going to plug that particular hole. And Chris Philip, the Shadow Home Secretary, said the case showed changes to human rights laws were needed so that Parliament, not judges, controlled who could settle in the UK. But back to Matthew Stadlen, because he's always got something utterly stupid to say about almost any subject.
Closed. Quite how it is closed isn't so clear. My understanding is that he was wrong, as Reem says, to say that this was allowed, this claim, under the Tory government.
Yeah.
The claim was rejected while the Tories were still in power.
Yes.
And when Labour came into power, it was allowed on appeal. That does.
Right, so you can see what happened. When the Conservatives were in power, they applied the law properly. But as soon as Labour came into power, it was reversed on appeal, and it was reversed by a judge. And obviously by a judge who felt empowered by the way our government, our new government has been behaving, felt empowered to do what he did.
Doesn't mean it's because there was a Labour government. So if there is a loophole, which there seems to
So
be.
yeah, it's not because of a Labour government, but it's because a judge felt that because of the way our government, the attitude our government has now, then he could reverse this rule.
Or the judges interpreted it as such, it appears, and that is a legacy of the previous government. But on the
It's not a legacy of the previous government. They had closed the Ukrainian exception down. But of course, he couldn't say anything without blaming the Tories, could he?
substance of it, clearly it seems to me that the Ukraine scheme should not be able to be used by asylum seekers from other countries. I mean, it is the Ukraine scheme.
Surely
but there is
name.
but there is another question, and Starmer's clear about that as well. But there is another question, and that is, we've all seen the utter devastation that has befallen.
Right, so here's Stadlen backtracking now because, of course, he has to show sympathy for the Gazans. We'll see how much sympathy in a minute, but, you know, to clear himself with his lefty pals, he has to put this in
Gaza. And some people will blame Israel, some people will blame Hamas, some people might blame both.
Oh, that's fence sitting.
I would blame both.
Yeah, he would blame both because he doesn't want to get himself out of humour with his, as I say, his lefty pals. But let's just look at what happened. A group of, a terrorist army invaded the southern part of Israel, committed unspeakable crimes, and then after they had moved on, the Gazan citizens who were not actually members of Hamas, not all obviously, but plenty of them, followed in their wake and then looted the houses when the bodies were still smoking from what Hamas had done to them. They were going through the fridges and stealing their food. And now they're getting payback. They get people like Stadlen saying, well, look, there are children crying among the rubble. Yeah, and if I were there seeing a child crying in the rubble, I would be very touched and upset as well. But what are the Israelis supposed to do? If Hamas had downed tools, none of this would have happened. There'd still be Gaza, there'd still be buildings, and there wouldn't be any children crying. There wouldn't be any rubble there for the children to cry in. It's down to Hamas. And he is not blaming Hamas. He's saying, well, yeah, on one side it's Hamas and on the other side it's Israel. No, it is 100% all Hamas. But he can't say that.
What we do know is the extent of the human suffering there. Unbelievable numbers of children.
Yeah. Well, down to Hamas. Now, have you considered what's happening now with these refugees? Obviously, somewhere has to be found for them. They are in... Well, let's look at it this way. Here we are in Europe. Ukraine was invaded by Russia. And what did we do in Europe? All of us, not just in Britain, in Poland, in France, in Germany. They all thought, oh God, these people, these poor people, they're in terrible trouble. Let's give them sanctuary. So we opened our borders to them. We let in the Ukrainians because they were in trouble. We stepped up and took our European responsibility for our European, for the people who are sharing our European continent. Why aren't the Muslims doing the same for the Palestinians? Why do they say, oh, no, it's our responsibility here in the UK? We're not even on the same continent. Why is Egypt not taking all these poor, suffering Gazan refugees? Why doesn't Stadlen ask, why is Hamas fighting from house to house, causing this trouble? And then why isn't Egypt taking these suffering people? He's not even thinking along those lines. And Jordan, again, just the other side of Israel, they're not taking. There are, I don't know how many Muslim states there are in the area. There must be about 20, and there are more. There's Iran. Iran is so worried about the Gazan refugees. Why isn't Iran taking them in? Or why not Morocco and Algeria? I mean, there are many of them. No. And this is why they're not taking them. Okay? This woman made this video within days of the October the 7th, 2023 attack. Sahar Shihada is a Palestinian student in Canada. Well, I don't know how Palestinian she is, but she certainly identifies that way. She's a student in Canada and she has no accent at all. She's a completely North American speaker. So this is somebody who has been exposed to Western values and also somebody who would know what went on because she has access to all the news. Right, this is what she says.
I support Hamas. History is made that day. Very proud of my people. Very, very proud. Would love it if they would do it again and again and again and again and again and again and again. No, they're not terrorists. I support every decision. And you know what? What they did was history. Very proud. History was made that day.
Just look at that self-satisfied expression on her face. That is the sort of person that Egypt doesn't want in its territory. The Egyptians don't want that in their territory. The Jordanians don't want that in their territory. They don't want somebody with a mind so filled with evil. This is the face of evil. Sadistic evil. And you want to see about sadism, you want to know a bit more about sadism, let's just have a look at this. Today, another 3 hostages were released. And when Hamas released these hostages, in a cruel stunt during today's hostage release in which Yair Horn, Sagui Dekel Chen, or maybe Chen, and Sasha Trufanov were handed over, Hamas gave Mr. Horn an hourglass with the images of hostage Matan Zangauka and his mother Einav. The inscription read, "Time is running out." Sadists. And you see this guy here, not a picture of health. Let's have a look. At the same time, Israel released some more prisoners. Now, these were prisoners who had committed crimes, terrorists mostly. This is one of them. The picture of health, by the looks of things, pretty well upholstered. He looks quite happy. Look at him. This is one of the Israeli hostages. And they've had time to fatten them up as well. He's probably in a better state than he was 3 or 4 weeks ago when they started dribbling out their hostage releases. This guy, look at him. Sadists. Evil, horrible, dreadful people. Now, I'm talking mostly about Hamas, but this woman here, she's not Hamas. So it's not just Hamas. And that's why the rest of the Arab world doesn't want this person in their towns and cities poisoning everyone else. And Canada, well, they're cool with that. OK, now let's just get on to this, which was sent to me by a subscriber. I always read your mail and I'm always very grateful for stories. This is Tintagel, and this is the site of the Camelot Castle Hotel. Now, many of you will know Tintagel as being near the site where King Arthur was supposed to have had his castle. This is the hotel we're talking about here. Right, let's get back to the GB News interview. Nice place, isn't it? Oh, and you see the township, the village behind it. Well, a lot of the people in that area behind the castle would, of course, be employed in some way, either in the hotel or in just looking after the tourists who would come and stay there. All those people, there would be grocers and cleaners and garden workers and administrators of various sorts. Even people like estate agents and that sort of thing would depend on the tourist industry that hotel would be attracting. Right. And it turns out that the government sent a communication to the owner of that hotel asking him if he would turn it over to the housing of illegal migrants. Yeah, I kid you not. Hang on a minute. Right, there we are. Let's get this started.
From the Home Office to house migrants. What did they offer you and why did you turn it down?
Well, it was a considerable amount of money, Beverly. It was probably double what we would normally make on a good year, because they offered full occupancy on a rolling contract for a year.
So how does that work? Somebody literally just picks up the phone to you, or do they send you a letter?
They sent us a letter first.
Right.
And to be honest with you, I thought it was a joke. And
because of the amount of money they were offering?
Well, I just couldn't believe that the government wanted to put, illegal migrants up in four-poster beds.
Yeah.
At Camelot Castle. I mean, it was absolutely remarkable.
Yeah.
It would have destroyed the village because one of the things they said is to lay off all the staff.
Did you get that? All the people who were employed, all the local people who were employed in that castle, in that hotel, they had to be laid off. They'd all lose their jobs. And that's because the government knew that the sort of people who would be housed in that hotel would not treat the female staff that well. There would be problems. There might even be serious problems. So what they would have to do is have people in the hotel looking after these migrants who were tough guys and who had signed some sort of a non-disclosure agreement, because there's something else that locals would do. They would talk about the migrants. They would talk about how they act and where they came from. So they would hermetically seal that hotel and get their own government-paid tough guys in there to look after these people. So we're not only paying for the hotel as taxpayers, but we're paying for the staff who would administer that hotel, and the people in there from where they come. We wouldn't know anything about that, would we? Okay, this would destroy the town. So what in fact allowing this to happen, the effect would be that bit of the rural economy would disappear. The people in the village who would have been employed there will have to go to the big towns or elsewhere to find some sort of gainful employment. The whole community would be destroyed, would fragment and would disappear, just like the government appear to be trying to do to the small farming communities. Do you think there's an agenda, or it's just total stupidity on the part of the government? I'll leave that for you to decide.
You're probably a big employer in the village.
Well, a major employer in the village,
Yeah.
and locally. And of course, those jobs in a village like Tintagel, they wouldn't be replaced.
No.
So, but also they would have stacked the place up with about 300 people, and you then have those people wandering around the village. I don't know whether they intended to contain them or whether they would be allowed out and about. I know in other areas, certainly hotels in Newquay have had some serious problems because there were a few hotels that did take the migrants there.
Presumably people who stay at your hotel then spend their money in the village.
Well, of course they do. They do spend their money there, and it would have destroyed the local economy. It's hard to say how many hundreds of thousands of pounds our guests spend in the village, but certainly a fair amount. But it's also the cultural degradation that goes along with this.
Okay, so the whole area would have been destroyed, and that man turned down a lot of money because he felt some responsibility to the local economy. Good for him. There are others who didn't. He mentioned Newquay, where some of the hoteliers turned their hotels over, and there will be a lot of people who are leaving Newquay because of that. But to a certain extent, you can't blame hoteliers for doing that, because the government are making providing employment for people so difficult. They're piling law upon law, which means that people who run businesses are being snowed under by all sorts of regulations and extra taxes. So there may be some people who took the government shilling, well, a lot more than a shilling, simply because the government have more or less blackmailed them into it. And that's another thing. So let's talk about the way the government think of the people they're governing. This fellow here is the Labour Education Minister, Stephen Morgan, and he runs, or ran, a WhatsApp group. And it says here it was filled with slurs against elderly protesters and veterans who opposed mass immigration. It branded pensioners as terrorists and disabled veterans as Nazi scum. This Nazi scum stuff, it's not new. This is Angela Rayner in, 2021, I think. They weren't in government yet, but still, Rayner was on the front bench. This is Christopher Clarkson, a Conservative Greater Manchester MP, who'd been making a speech arguing against the Labour Greater Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham's decision to refuse the highest restrictions in the area. I don't know what that's about. But anyway, he's making this speech, and he's obviously speaking against a mayor who is a Labour Party member and speaks for the Labour Party in many ways in Manchester. All right, so Right Honourable Christopher Clarkson.
Just need to see it in the support, U-turn, oppose approach. that's characterised their hindsight-heavy behaviour. But, excuse me, did the Honourable Lady just call me scum?
Order! From the front bench, we will not have remarks like that. Not under any circumstances, no matter how heartfelt it might be. Not at all.
Right, that's Angela Rayner referring to one of her parliamentary colleagues. I mean, they're the opposition, but still, they're in the same debating chamber. She just shouted scum at him, like the student radical that she never quite grew out of. And here we have these guys. Now Rayner has not been known to call anyone scum after that in the debating chamber. But obviously it's something that is in the Labour Party's mentality. And this guy called pensioners and disabled veterans Nazi scum. Oh no, pensioners are just terrorists. Now, we did start this video with JD Vance talking about freedom of speech. So I want to make it clear. He has every right to call disabled veterans Nazi scum. Where I draw the line is when he is supposed to be representing these people and calls them Nazi scum. He is in a position of power over them. And he is using that position of power to dehumanise them. I find that most objectionable and disturbing. Right, well, that's it for the Saturday grab bag for another week. Till next time. You can help my channel by subscribing and clicking the notification bell. That's quite important. And by sharing if you're so inclined. Links to my other channels and to donation methods are in the description. But the best way you can help is simply by clicking like and notify. Thank you.